The air in CCOT was a thick, suffocating blanket, heavy with sweat, stale food, and the metallic tang of fear, a constant, invisible companion. Mateo breathed it in, a reflex now, his lungs burning with each shallow gasp, each breath a small rebellion against the filth and the dread. He kept his head down, always, a small act of defiance against the hundreds of shaved heads, the tattooed arms, the watchful eyes that seemed to follow his every move. The concrete walls shimmered with heat, a constant, oppressive presence, reflecting the unforgiving Salvadoran sun, its glare bouncing off the high perimeter walls, blinding and relentless. This was a new prison, a monument to control, its design intended to crush the spirit, to homogenize all who entered, to make them just another number in a sea of despair. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of shouted orders, the deafening clanging of cell doors, and the low, guttural murmur of men pushed to their limits, a symphony of suffering. Survival here was not about strength, Mateo had learned. It was about invisibility, a quiet desperation to not be seen, to not be chosen by the random caprice of a guard or the targeted malice of a rival gang. But even invisibility was a fragile shield, easily shattered, like glass, by a stray glance, a wrong step, or an unspoken challenge that erupted from the simmering tensions. The gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, they moved like shadows. Their presence felt more than seen, a silent, deadly understanding passing between them, a truce always on the verge of breaking. Mateo knew the rules. He knew what happened when those rules were broken, a lesson etched deep into the collective memory of every man incarcerated here, a chilling, unspoken history. He remembered the first week. A man had been found slumped in the latrine, his eyes wide, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. A warning, silent and brutal, for all to witness and understand. No one spoke of it, not directly, but the message was clear. Fall in line, or become another anonymous statistic in this concrete tomb, another forgotten name in a place that erased identities. Mateo just wanted to see his daughter again, a small, impossible dream he clung to, a fragile thread of hope in the suffocating darkness, his only tether to a world beyond these walls. That dream, it was his only reason to endure, to navigate the unseen currents of danger, to avoid the sharks that swam in these troubled waters, predators both human and systemic. He watched a guard, a hulking figure in a crisp uniform, his face a mask of indifference, scanning the yard with an almost casual contempt, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. The guard's eyes, they were like cold stones, promising nothing but swift, unfeeling justice for any transgression, real or imagined, a silent, ever-present threat. Mateo tightened his grip on the worn book he pretended to read, his eyes scanning the yard instead, always scanning, always alert, seeking patterns, deciphering warnings. A group of older inmates, their faces hardened by years inside, gathered near the water spigot, their voices low, their movements slow, deliberate, their bodies coiled with a suppressed energy. He saw a flicker of tension pass between two of them, a silent exchange, a challenge perhaps, or a threat, a territory dispute. He could not tell which specific issue it was, only that it was there. This place, it bred conflict like a disease, a constant, simmering pressure cooker, waiting to explode, its violence a predictable, if unpredictable, certainty. Mateo just needed to survive the night, and then the next day, and then the one after that. An endless chain of moments, each a small victory against the odds, each a breath towards tomorrow. He felt the tremor in his gut, a familiar companion now, a cold knot of dread that never truly loosened, a constant hum beneath his skin. But he would not break, not here, Not yet. He would fight, with quiet resilience, for that one small dream of freedom, of his daughter's face, of a world beyond these walls, a world he might never touch again, but one he would never forget. The usual afternoon lull, a brief respite from the relentless tension, was shattered by a sudden, jarring commotion near the mess hall entrance. Mateo, who had been meticulously folding his meager blanket in his cell, felt a jolt of adrenaline, a cold splash of fear. He froze, his ears straining, trying to decipher the shouts, the crashing sounds, the unmistakable thud of bodies hitting concrete. It was an eruption, a violent burst, a stark contrast to the low hum of anxiety that usually permeated the air. He pressed his ear against the cold steel of his cell door, his heart hammering against his ribs, each beat a frantic drum against the encroaching chaos. Through the narrow slit of the observation window, Mateo saw it, a swirling vortex of blue uniforms and tattooed skin, a desperate struggle unfolding with brutal efficiency. Guards, their faces grim, their movements precise, were attempting to separate two warring factions, a bloody clash between MS-13 and Barrio 18, the long simmering rivalry finally boiling over. He recognized faces, a burly enforcer for Barrio 18, known as El Toro, his eyes burning with a wild, uncontrollable rage, and across from him, a younger, leaner MS-13 member, his face a mask of cold fury, a crude shiv glinting in his hand. The shiv, it was a piece of sharpened metal, a lethal instrument, a symbol of the desperate measures men resorted to in this place. A guard, caught in the crossfire, screamed as a blow landed, a sickening crack echoing through the confined space. The other guards, their patience clearly at an end, retaliated with a brutal efficiency, batons swinging, their blows indiscriminate, finding targets on both sides. The air filled with guttural cries, the metallic tang of blood, the desperate pleas of men being overwhelmed, a symphony of suffering that threatened to deafen Mateo. He instinctively recoiled from the window, pressing himself against the far wall of his cell, wishing for invisibility, for the earth to swallow him whole, to disappear from this unfolding nightmare. Then, a sudden, heavy pounding on his cell door, a relentless, insistent demand, made Mateo jump, his breath hitched, his eyes darting to the door, a cold dread seizing his gut. It was a guard, his voice hoarse, shouting orders, demanding that he open the door, that he join the fray, that he choose a side. "Mateo, open up! We need bodies. You with us, or are you against us?" The words, they were a hammer blow, forcing a decision, shattering his carefully constructed neutrality, his desperate attempt to remain unseen, to remain untouched. He could hear the distant shouts of other inmates being dragged out, the muffled protests, the sounds of scuffles, a clear indication that this was not an isolated incident, but a systematic roundup. The guard outside his cell, he was relentless, his fist slamming against the steel, a rhythmic, terrifying beat. Mateo knew, with a sickening certainty, that choosing not to choose was still a choice, and in this place, neutrality often carried the highest price. Refusing to join the guards, it would mark him, forever, as an enemy, a dissident, a target for their brutal, arbitrary justice. But joining them, it meant betraying his own fragile sense of self, his humanity, becoming a participant in the violence he so desperately tried to avoid. An accomplice, a pawn in their brutal game. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, a fleeting second of quiet desperation, the image of his daughter's face flashing through his mind, a silent prayer, a desperate plea for guidance. The pounding on the door intensified, becoming a frantic, impatient clamor. He had to make a choice, right now, in this moment of pure terror, a decision that would undoubtedly shape the rest of his time in this hellish place, a choice that might even seal his fate. The choice was not between good and evil, but between two different forms of survival, two different paths through a landscape of suffering, each fraught with its own dangers, each demanding its own price. With a heavy sigh, a silent acceptance of his grim reality, Mateo reached for the cold, unforgiving steel of the door handle, his hand trembling, his resolve wavering, but his decision made. He had to choose. He had no other option. Not if he wanted to see tomorrow. Not if he wanted to hold on to that fragile dream of freedom. The heavy steel door groaned open with a chilling metallic shriek, echoing the scream of the inmate Mateo had heard moments before. The guard, a thick-necked man with a permanent sneer, glared at him, his eyes devoid of any warmth, a cold, calculating gaze. "Took you long enough, prisoner," he spat, his voice a low growl. "Move it, now, or feel the stick." Mateo stepped out, his body tense, his every muscle screaming in protest, his mind racing, trying to process the shift in his reality, the sudden, forced participation. The hallway was a scene of controlled chaos, guards herding inmates like cattle, their batons cracking against backs and legs, a harsh symphony of fear and pain. He was pushed towards the mess hall, the sounds of the brawl now closer, louder, more visceral. The air in the mess hall was thick with the stench of blood, sweat, and cheap disinfectant, a potent, sickening cocktail. Inmates, battered and bleeding, were being systematically subdued, their resistance futile against the organized brutality of the guards. Mateo saw El Toro, his face a bruised mess, being dragged away, his eyes blazing with a defiant rage, a promise of future retribution. The MS-13 member with the shiv, he was nowhere to be seen, lost in the scrum. Perhaps already taken to the infamous punishment cells, a place where whispers said men often disappeared. Mateo was handed a heavy rubber baton, its weight unfamiliar, uncomfortable in his trembling hand. He looked at the guard who handed it to him, a younger man, his face flushed with adrenaline, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "You see one of them move, you hit them, understand?" The young guard barked, his voice trembling slightly, betraying his inexperience, his own fear. "No exceptions, no questions. They're all the same." Mateo nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak, the bitter taste of compliance coating his tongue. He was now one of them, a temporary enforcer, an unwilling participant in the brutal subjugation of his fellow prisoners, a role he never wanted, a role that filled him with self-loathing. He watched as a guard, a veteran with tired eyes, struck an inmate who was already on his knees. His hands tied behind his back. The blow, it was swift and merciless, a dull thud that resonated deep in Mateo's bones. The inmate crumpled, a soft groan escaping his lips, his head hitting the concrete floor with a sickening crack. The guards, they showed no emotion, no remorse, their faces blank, their actions mechanical, detached. This was the law of the prison, Mateo realized, not the written rules, but the unwritten code of power and submission, a brutal hierarchy enforced by fear and violence. As the last of the resisting inmates were subdued, dragged away into the echoing silence of the halls, a strange quiet descended upon the mess hall, a chilling stillness that was almost more terrifying than the previous chaos. It was then, in that unnatural quiet, that Mateo felt it, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning, a prickle on the back of his neck. A whisper, faint and indistinct, seemed to drift through the empty spaces, a soft, ethereal murmur, like voices from another time, another place. He looked around, his eyes scanning the shadowed corners, the high ceilings, the oppressive concrete. There was nothing. No visible source, just the lingering scent of blood and fear, and that faint, almost imperceptible whisper. He dismissed it as a trick of his mind, a consequence of the adrenaline, the fear, the exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by the stress, his mind playing cruel tricks. But the feeling, it persisted, a subtle, unsettling presence, a sense that something ancient, something dark, something unknown had been awakened by the violence, by the blood spilled on these unforgiving floors. It was not the fear of the guards, nor the fear of the gangs, but a different kind of fear, a primal dread that settled deep in his gut, a cold, insidious tendril. This prison. It was more than just concrete and steel, he realized. It was a place where spirits lingered, where the echoes of past suffering resonated, a place where the veil between worlds felt thin, fragile, almost transparent. He had stepped across a threshold, not just into the violence of the prison, but into something far older, far more unsettling, something that hummed beneath the surface, waiting. He tightened his grip on the baton, its weight a poor comfort, and tried to ignore the whisper, tried to rationalize the chill, but a seed of dread had been planted, a chilling premonition of horrors yet to come. The days following the mess hall riot were punctuated by an unnerving calm, a brittle peace that felt more like a prelude to disaster than a genuine cessation of hostilities. Mateo, now branded as a temporary trustee in the eyes of the guards, found himself caught between two unforgiving worlds. The other inmates, especially those affiliated with Barrio 18, regarded him with cold, calculating stares, their unspoken accusations hanging heavy in the air, a constant, tangible threat. He felt their resentment, a burning animosity that promised future pain, future retribution. The MS-13 members, though fewer in number in this particular block, maintained a wary distance, their eyes equally unreadable, equally dangerous. He was an outsider now, a pariah, marked by his coerced participation, forever tainted by the blood on his hands, even if it was not his own. Even if he did not swing the baton, his presence was enough. His duties as a trustee were demeaning, scrubbing floors slick with stale water and lingering grime, carrying heavy buckets of slop for distribution. But they also offered a modicum of freedom, a brief respite from the suffocating confines of his cell. It was during these solitary tasks, in the quieter, darker corners of the facility, that the whispers returned, no longer faint, no longer easily dismissed. They were clearer now, distinct, though still garbled, a cacophony of overlapping voices echoing from the ventilation shafts, from behind the thick concrete walls, from the very foundations of the prison itself. They sounded like pleas, like desperate cries, like the ragged breaths of men suffocating, a chilling symphony of distress that gnawed at Mateo's sanity. One afternoon, while sweeping a rarely used corridor leading to an old utility room, Mateo felt a sudden, intense drop in temperature, a cold spot that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He shivered. Despite the oppressive heat of the prison, a deep, internal chill that seeped into his bones. A faint, almost transparent shadow seemed to flit across the wall at the far end of the corridor, a fleeting, humanoid shape that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, convinced it was an optical illusion, a trick of the light, but the icy dread in his gut persisted, refusing to be reasoned away. The whispers, they intensified, swirling around him, almost forming coherent words, fragments of a language he could not quite grasp, a language of suffering, of despair. Later that week, a fight broke out in the shower block, a quick, brutal exchange between two men from rival gangs. It was over almost before it began. One man left bleeding profusely from a deep cut on his arm, the other quickly subdued by an arriving guard. As Mateo was cleaning up the blood-splattered tiles, his stomach churning, he noticed something unusual. Etched into the concrete near the drain, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, was a crude symbol, a series of interlocking lines forming an intricate, almost ritualistic pattern. It looked ancient, primal, unlike any gang tattoo or prison graffiti he had ever seen, its origin shrouded in mystery, its purpose unknown. He knelt, wiping away the grime with the corner of his tattered rag, his finger tracing the cold, hard lines. A sudden, sharp, prickling sensation shot through his fingertip, a small, almost imperceptible sting, as if the concrete itself was alive, reacting to his touch. The whispers, they pulsed around him, louder, Yashia, more urgent, more menacing, a frantic chorus of unseen voices. He quickly recoiled, his heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. This was not just a symbol, he realized. It was a mark, a sign, a gateway, perhaps, to something far darker than the routine violence of the prison. The supernaturals, the ghosts, the unseen forces he had tried to dismiss, they were real. He knew it now. Their presence undeniable, their influence growing stronger. The prison, it was built on something ancient, something that demanded recognition, something that fed on the suffering, on the spilled blood, on the fear that permeated every stone, every crack, every inch of this hellish place. He was not just fighting for survival against men. He was fighting against an unseen enemy, a pervasive malevolence that thrived in the shadows, waiting for its moment to claim its due. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that his struggles had only just begun. Mateo's fragile alliance with the guards, if it could even be called that, began to fray almost immediately. His reluctance to participate in the casual brutality, his subtle acts of kindness, like quietly sharing his meager bread with a starving inmate or offering a sympathetic glance to a man being beaten, did not go unnoticed. He was no longer just an inmate doing his time. He was a variable, an unpredictable element in their carefully controlled ecosystem of despair. The younger guard, the one who had handed him the baton during the riot, now watched him with suspicion. His eyes narrowed, his jaw set, a silent accusation hanging in the air whenever their paths crossed. The old guard, the veteran with the tired eyes, simply ignored him, a more chilling form of condemnation, a silent withdrawal of any perceived protection. The gangs, sensing his growing isolation, his lack of true affiliation, began to circle him like vultures. El Toro, released from solitary, his face still bruised, his eyes cold and hard, confronted Mateo in the yard one afternoon. "You think you're better than us, Mateo," he snarled, his voice a low growl. "You think you can just choose your side and walk away?" Mateo kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the dusty ground, knowing that any perceived disrespect would escalate the confrontation into something far more dangerous. He mumbled an apology, a generic statement of regret, hoping to defuse the situation, to avoid the inevitable. El Toro simply spat on the ground near Mateo's foot, a clear gesture of contempt, a chilling reminder of his precarious position. "Remember who you are, Mateo," he whispered, a promise of pain, "and remember who we are." The whispers from the unseen forces grew stronger, more insistent, no longer confined to the abandoned corridors. They followed Mateo now, even into his cell, a soft, ethereal chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the darkness itself. He would wake in the dead of night, his body drenched in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, convinced he heard his name being called. A faint, desperate plea carried on the stale, recycled air. He would sit up, straining his ears, his eyes wide, scanning the shadows, his breath hitched in his throat. But there was never anything there, just the oppressive silence of the cell block and the echoing beat of his own terrified heart. One night he saw it, not a shadow, not a fleeting glimpse, but a distinct, ghostly apparition. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face a mask of profound sorrow, his eyes hollow, his skin translucent. He stood at the foot of Mateo's bed, his form shimmering slightly, like heat rising from asphalt, a silent, sorrowful specter. The man raised a spectral hand, pointing a long skeletal finger towards the far wall of the cell, towards a specific spot before dissolving into the shadows, leaving behind a lingering chill, a profound sense of despair that seemed to permeate the very air. Mateo sat frozen, his blood running cold, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. He rubbed his eyes, pinched himself, desperate to believe it was a nightmare, a hallucination. But the residual chill, the lingering scent of something ancient and mournful, it was too real. He stared at the spot on the wall where the apparition had pointed, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. There was nothing there, just the rough, unyielding concrete stained with years of grime and neglect. But then he noticed it, a faint discoloration, a subtle difference in the texture of the wall, almost imperceptible, as if something had once been hidden there, something that had been plastered over, smoothed away, but not forgotten, not truly erased. He felt a deep, unsettling certainty, an intuition that vibrated through his very being, that this was not merely a random haunting, but a message, a warning, a desperate plea from the spectral inhabitants of this cursed place. The guards, the gangs, their threats, they now seemed almost trivial in comparison to this new, insidious terror, this encroaching supernatural dread. He was no longer just fighting for physical survival. He was fighting for his sanity, for his very soul, against forces he could not comprehend, forces that whispered from the shadows, forces that pointed to secrets buried deep within the walls of CECOT, secrets that promised to unravel his understanding of this world, and perhaps the next. The system, in its brutality, had opened a door, a gateway to something ancient, something that had been slumbering, waiting for its moment to awaken. And Mateo, unwittingly, had become its chosen recipient, its reluctant witness. The image of the spectral man, his gaunt face and pointing finger, burned into Mateo's mind, an unshakable vision. The spot on the wall of his cell, seemingly innocuous, now held an ominous significance, a silent accusation. He spent the next few days in a torment of conflicted emotions, fear wrestling with a burgeoning, desperate curiosity. The whispers, constant companions now, seemed to emanate directly from that section of the wall, a low, urgent hum of distressed voices, drawing him closer. He knew the risks of investigating. The guards' eyes were everywhere, and any deviation from routine, any suspicious activity, would be met with swift, brutal punishment. But the pull was too strong, the mystery too compelling, a desperate need for understanding in a place devoid of reason. During the brief, chaotic period of afternoon yard time, Mateo observed the wall from different angles, trying to discern any hidden features. The cement was old, cracked in places, but generally uniform. The discoloration he had noticed was subtle, almost like a faint water stain, blending seamlessly with the weathered surface. Yet in his mind's eye, he could still see the spectral finger pointing, a clear, unmistakable directive. He felt a growing conviction, a chilling intuition, that beneath that plaster, something significant lay hidden, something that the spectral residents of CECOT desperately wanted him to find. That night, unable to sleep, Mateo acted. The other inmates in his cell block were either asleep or lost in their own misery, their breathing heavy, their occasional snores echoing softly in the oppressive silence. He waited until the rhythmic footsteps of the patrolling guard had faded down the corridor, their heavy boots a signal of brief safety. With trembling hands, he began to scrape at the discolored patch on the wall, using a sharpened shard of metal he had meticulously filed from a discarded spoon, a secret he had guarded for months. The cement was harder than he expected, each scratch a painstaking effort, each faint sound a potential betrayal. His muscles ached, his fingers cramped, but he pressed on, driven by a primal urge, a desperate need to uncover the truth. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence of the cell broken only by the faint scraping sound and the frantic beat of his own heart. A fine dust, gritty and gray, accumulated on his blanket. Then, with a sudden yielding give, the cement chipped away, revealing a dark, hollow waptisi behind it. Mateo gasped, his breath catching in his throat, a mix of terror and exhilarating revelation washing over him. He widened the opening carefully, his fingers probing the darkness within. His fingertips brushed against something cold, smooth, and unexpectedly soft. He pulled it out, slowly, carefully, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. It was a small, leather-bound journal, old and worn, its cover brittle with age, its pages discolored. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper of voices seemed to emanate from the journal itself, a chilling affirmation of its supernatural connection. He quickly concealed it beneath his blanket, his heart still hammering, his body trembling as the sound of the guards' returning footsteps echoed down the corridor. He feigned sleep, his eyes tightly closed, the journal clutched tightly in his hand, its presence a heavy weight, a significant burden. Later, under the meager glow of the single, flickering bulb in his cell, Mateo carefully opened the journal. The handwriting was faded, cramped, a difficult script to decipher, but the words were clear enough, chillingly so. It was the diary of a former prisoner, a man named Miguel, who had been incarcerated in the 1980s during the Civil War in what was then a political detention center, long before it became the high-tech prison of CECOT. The entry spoke of brutal interrogations, summary executions, and disappearances, a harrowing chronicle of state-sanctioned violence. But then the tone shifted, subtly, insidiously. Miguel began to write about the shadow people, the cold spots, the whispers from the walls. He spoke of rituals performed by the guards, dark ceremonies conducted in the dead of night, sacrifices offered to some nameless entity, something that demanded blood, something that thrived on suffering, something that permeated the very fabric of the building, a malevolent presence that was slowly consuming them all. Mateo's blood ran cold. The symbol he had seen etched in the shower block, the whispers, the ghostly apparition, it all made a horrifying, undeniable sense now. This prison was not just a place of human suffering, it was a dark altar, a vortex of malevolent energy, a place where the veil between worlds had been torn open, allowing something ancient and terrible to seep into their reality. His fight for survival had just taken a terrifying turn, a plunge into the depths of a supernatural horror he could barely comprehend. His strategy had to change, drastically, immediately. He was no longer just a prisoner, he was a discoverer, a witness, perhaps even the chosen one, the one who had to expose this monstrous secret before it consumed them all. The revelations contained within Miguel's journal were a poisoned chalice for Mateo, a horrifying truth that granted understanding but offered no solace. The words faded with time, but burning with an unholy clarity, painted a picture of a prison far more insidious than he could have ever imagined, a place where the cruelty of man mingled with something ancient and malevolent. He now saw the crude symbol in the shower block not as gang graffiti, but as a blasphemous sigil, a key to a horrifying ritual. The whispers, no longer mere phantoms of his stressed mind, were the desperate cries of souls trapped by a sinister pact. The burden of this knowledge was immense, a heavy shroud that suffocated any hope of a simple, quiet survival. He knew he could not ignore it, not now, but sharing it, exposing it, meant risking everything, not just his life, but potentially his sanity, against a force that commanded both human enforcers and supernatural entities. His fear of the guards, of El Toro, now felt almost trivial, compared to the cold dread of what lurked beneath the prison's foundation, a terror that seemed to breathe through the very concrete. The first concrete price for his newfound knowledge came swiftly, brutally, and from an unexpected quarter. His brief, uneasy, trusty status, which had afforded him limited movement and a sliver of privilege, was abruptly revoked. He was cornered by the younger guard, the one with the suspicious gaze, in the dimly lit corridor near the laundry room. The guard's face was contorted into a snarl, his eyes burning with a controlled fury. "You think we don't see you, prisoner?" he hissed, his voice low, menacing. "You think your little acts of defiance go unnoticed?" Mateo's mind raced, trying to understand what he had done. What small misstep had triggered this sudden, brutal reprisal? Had he been seen with the journal? Had a tremor of his fear or his knowledge somehow been perceived by their watchful eyes? He could not imagine how. He had been so careful. But the guards, they operated on a different plane of logic, a perverse system of arbitrary power, their accusations often unfounded, their punishments disproportionate. The guard shoved him against the cold, unyielding wall, the impact knocking the wind out of Mateo's lungs. His head hit the concrete with a dull thud, a dizzying pain blooming behind his eyes. Before he could recover, the guard's fist connected with his stomach, a sharp, sickening blow that doubled him over, his breath catching in a choked gasp. "We know about your little secrets, Mateo," the guard whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "We know you're not playing by the rules." The words sent a fresh wave of terror through Mateo. Did they know about the journal, about Miguel's writings, about the dark secret of the prison? Or was it simply a general warning, a message to keep him in line, to crush any burgeoning sense of individuality? He crumpled to the floor, coughing, clutching his aching stomach, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. The guard stood over him, a dark, imposing silhouette, his face obscured by the shadows. "Consider this a reminder, Mateo," he said, his voice laced with cold satisfaction. "This prison has its own way of dealing with troublemakers. You understand?" Then, with a final contemptuous kick to his side, the guard turned and walked away, his heavy boots echoing down the corridor, leaving Mateo to writhe in pain and fear. Mateo lay there, his body aching, his mind reeling. The physical pain was sharp, undeniable, but the emotional cost was far greater. His carefully constructed facade of neutrality, his desperate hope of simply fading into the background, had been utterly shattered. He was now a marked man, not just by the gangs, but by the guards, their eyes on him, their suspicion a tangible weight. The journal, hidden in his cell, felt like a burning coal against his skin, a source of both revelation and immense danger. He had paid a concrete price, a physical and emotional toll, for his proximity to the truth, a brutal introduction to the consequences of knowing too much, of seeing too much in a place designed to keep its secrets buried. The game had changed, the stakes had risen, and Mateo was now, undeniably, an active player in a terrifying drama, a target for both human and spectral forces, caught in a terrifying web, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The beating was a clear declaration, a brutal statement that echoed through the prison's unspoken code. Mateo's body ached, a constant throb of pain, a harsh reminder of his precarious standing. His face was swollen, a purpling bruise blooming on his cheekbone, a visible mark of the guard's displeasure. He limped, his ribs protesting with every step, but he moved with a newfound sense of grim determination. The physical pain, however acute, paled in comparison to the chilling knowledge he now possessed, the horrifying truths whispered from the pages of Miguel's journal. The incident ignited a subtle but noticeable shift in the already volatile atmosphere of the prison. The guards, emboldened by their public display of force, became even more aggressive, their patrols more frequent, their batons swinging with renewed zeal. There was a palpable increase in tension, a simmering resentment among the inmates, a slow burn that threatened to erupt into another explosion of violence. Small skirmishes broke out more often, petty arguments escalating into bloody brawls, a constant low-level war breaking out, a steady stream of blood and pain. The medical bay, usually a place of quiet desperation, was now a constant scene of urgent activity, filled with the groans of men, patching up the casualties of this escalating brutality. The whispers, too, grew in intensity, no longer just a background hum, but a pervasive, almost suffocating presence. They seemed to cling to the shadows, to seep from the very stones of the prison, a frantic chorus of disembodied voices that spoke of injustice, of torture, of agonizing deaths, of ancient rituals, of sacrifices. Mateo heard fragments of names, chilling accounts of disappearances, desperate pleas for release, for peace, for retribution, all echoing from the depths of the prison's dark history. He would catch glimpses of fleeting shadows, of translucent forms flitting at the periphery of his vision, their spectral presence growing bolder, more frequent, more insistent, no longer confined to the privacy of his cell. One afternoon, while he was confined to his cell, restricted from trusty duties, Mateo overheard a chilling conversation between two guards outside his door. Their voices were low, guarded, but the fear in their tone was unmistakable, a tremor of genuine terror that sent a shiver down his spine. They spoke of a bad night, of strange sounds coming from the old utility tunnels beneath the prison, a place supposedly sealed off, its access long forgotten. They mentioned a missing inmate, a man who had gone to the infirmary with a minor cut and had simply vanished, leaving no trace, no explanation, just an empty bed and a lingering sense of unease. "The thing takes what it wants," one guard whispered, his voice barely audible, "and there's nothing we can do about it." The other guard mumbled a frightened agreement, his voice filled with a profound sense of helplessness. Mateo's blood ran cold. The journal entries about the ancient entity, the dark ceremonies, the sacrifices, they suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The thing the guards spoke of, it was real, it was alive, it was here, thriving on the suffering within these walls, demanding its tribute, its sustenance. The missing inmate, his disappearance was not just another prison mystery, but a ritualistic offering, a chilling confirmation of the supernatural horror Miguel had meticulously documented. The whispers in his cell intensified, swirling around him like an invisible storm, a frantic chorus of warning and despair. He felt a profound sense of dread, a chilling certainty that the escalation of violence, the guards' increased brutality, the intensified gang skirmishes, it was all part of a larger, more sinister design. The entity, it was feeding, growing stronger, its influence spreading, turning men against each other, driving them to desperation, preparing them for its ultimate consumption. The prison was not just a containment facility, it was a harvesting ground, a place where fear and pain were cultivated, a dark, pulsing heart of malevolence. Mateo knew, with a horrifying clarity, that he was no longer just an inmate trying to survive a brutal system. He was trapped in a fight for his very soul, a desperate struggle against a pervasive evil that had infected the very foundations of this place, an evil that demanded blood, an evil that was now fully awake, its insatiable hunger growing with every passing moment, with every new casualty. The massacre Miguel had alluded to in his final, fragmented entries, the night when the veil broke, it was not a historical event, but a prophecy, a terrifying future that seemed to be rapidly approaching, a future that threatened to consume them all. He clutched the journal under his blanket, its brittle pages a cold comfort, its words a terrifying roadmap to the impending apocalypse within these walls. Mateo, his body still aching from the guard's beating, found himself caught in a desperate race against an invisible clock. The prison's escalating violence, the missing inmates, the chilling whispers all pointed to an impending climax, a night of terror that resonated with Miguel's ominous warnings. He clung to the journal, its brittle pages a fragile lifeline in a sea of despair, its fragmented entries offering glimpses of a potential solution, a desperate strategy to combat the pervasive evil. Miguel had hinted at a way to disrupt the entity, a specific ritual, a countermeasure, but the details were frustratingly vague, obscured by fear and fragmented memories. He believed the key lay in the old utility tunnels, the very place the guards had spoken of with such dread, the sealed-off area where the bad night was said to originate. If he could find the heart of the ritual, the source of the entity's power, perhaps he could sever its connection to this world. Perhaps he could stop the escalating horror. Perhaps he could prevent the massacre. This belief, however tenuous, became his singular focus, his desperate hope in the face of overwhelming dread. He started meticulously planning, mapping out routes during his limited movements, observing guard rotations, searching for weak points in the prison's seemingly impenetrable security. His first attempt to access the utility tunnels was a disaster. He had identified a rusty access panel in the back of the laundry room, partially obscured by stacks of old stained linens. He waited for the opportune moment, when the yard was bustling, distracting the guards, and the laundry attendant, a docile older inmate, was momentarily preoccupied. With trembling hands, he tried to pry open the panel, using a sharpened piece of metal, the same one he had used to extract the journal. The hinges were stiff, rusted solid, resisting his efforts with an infuriating tenacity. Each creak, each groan of metal seemed to echo loudly in the confined space, a betrayal of his clandestine efforts. Just as he felt the panel begin to give, a loud, guttural shout shattered the quiet. "Hey, you prisoner, what do you think you're doing?" It was the younger guard, his face contorted in anger, his hand already on his baton. Mateo froze, his heart plummeting, his carefully constructed plan crumbling around him. He quickly tried to feign nonchalance, pretending to adjust some stacked laundry, but the guard's eyes were sharp, suspicious, and unwavering. The flimsy excuse died on his lips, unconvincing, desperate. The guard advanced, his footsteps heavy, menacing. He grabbed Mateo by the arm, his grip like a vice, dragging him away from the access panel. "Trying to escape, are we, rat?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You think you can just wander where you please in my prison?" Mateo tried to explain, to offer some coherent reason for his presence, but the words caught in his throat, his terror rendering him speechless. The guard didn't wait for an explanation. He shoved Mateo roughly against a nearby wall, the impact jarring his already bruised ribs. Then, with a cold, deliberate movement, he lifted his baton, its rubber head gleaming ominously in the dim light. The blow landed squarely on Mateo's shoulder, a searing pain that shot down his arm, making his hand go numb. He cried out, a strangled gasp, his body slumping against the wall. The guard delivered another blow, this time to his thigh, a dull thud that sent a fresh wave of agony through him. "That's for trying to sneak around," the guard barked, his voice devoid of emotion. "And this is for thinking you're smarter than us." A third blow, sharp and precise, landed on his wrist, a sickening crack echoing in the small room. Mateo knew, with a horrifying certainty, that something had broken. His hand, the one that held the journal, the one that needed to uncover the truth, now hung useless, a mangled mess of pain and bone. As the guard walked away, his heavy boots sounding like death knells, Mateo crumpled to the floor, his vision blurring. Tears of pain and frustration streaming down his face. His plan, his desperate hope, it had shattered, along with his wrist. He was injured, severely, unable to use his hand, his ability to execute any future strategy severely compromised. The journal, still hidden in his cell, now felt like a cruel joke, its secrets out of reach, its promised hope a bitter illusion. The whispers, they intensified around him, a mocking chorus of despair, their spectral laughter seeming to fill the room, echoing his own crushing failure. He was alone, broken, and now, without a working hand, the true horror of his situation, the utter futility of his fight, settled over him like a cold, suffocating shroud. His hope, it was a fragile thing, easily crushed, and now it lay shattered on the grimy floor, leaving him with nothing but pain and despair. The pain in Mateo's wrist was a constant, throbbing torment, a relentless reminder of his failed attempt and the crushing weight of his situation. The prison doctor, a jaded man with tired eyes, had splinted it roughly, muttering about insubordination and the consequences of playing hero. But the physical agony was only a fraction of his suffering. He was confined to his cell, the injured hand rendering him useless for any manual task, a prisoner within a prisoner. The journal, hidden beneath his mattress, now felt like a cruel taunt, its knowledge inaccessible, its warnings more potent than ever. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of pain, fear, and profound despair. Mateo lay on his bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of guilt, regret, and terrifying visions. He saw his daughter's face, clear as day, her innocent eyes filled with an unspoken question, a silent plea for his return. He had failed her, he knew, failed to protect himself, failed to find a way out, failed to keep that fragile thread of hope alive. He had been so focused on uncovering the prison's dark secrets, on fighting an unseen evil, that he had forgotten the simple, fundamental rule of survival in this place: invisibility. His attempts at heroism had only made him a target, broken him, and now left him more vulnerable than ever. The whispers, no longer just a distant hum, now clawed at his sanity, a cacophony of anguished voices swirling around him inside his head. They spoke of the lost, of the forgotten, of those consumed by the entity, their pleas for help turning into desperate cries, then into mocking laughter. He saw the spectral figures more frequently now, not just the gaunt man, but others. Translucent, tormented faces pressed against the bars of his cell, their hollow eyes filled with an ancient sorrow, a chilling testament to the prison's grim history. They seemed to accuse him, their silent stares a judgment, a confirmation of his failure, his inability to save them, to save himself. He wrestled with his own conscience, the weight of his past crimes pressing down on him, mingling with the new guilt of his current predicament. He had ended up in CECOT because of his own choices, his own wrong turns, a desperate act of desperation that had spiraled into violence. He had justified his actions then, telling himself it was for his family, for his daughter. But now, stripped bare of all pretenses, he saw the ugliness of his past, the moral compromises, the innocent lives he had impacted, the darkness he had allowed to fester within himself. He was no hero, he realized. He was just another broken man, trapped in a cage of his own making, his hands stained with blood, both literally and figuratively. A profound sense of emptiness settled over him, a dark night of the soul that threatened to consume him entirely. He felt utterly alone, utterly hopeless, isolated from the world outside, from his daughter, from any chance of redemption. The entity, the prison's malevolent heart, it seemed to be winning, its insidious tendrils reaching into his mind, preying on his despair, feeding on his guilt, eroding his will to live. He questioned everything, his motives, his sanity, his very existence. What was the point of fighting, of struggling, of enduring this endless torture, if there was no escape, no redemption, no hope for a future? The walls of his cell seemed to press in on him, suffocating him, the darkness growing deeper, colder, more absolute. He felt the cold embrace of surrender, a tempting release from the constant pain, the constant fear, the endless torment. He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow, allowing the despair to wash over him, to claim him, to pull him down into the depths of its icy grip. His daughter's face, it faded, became indistinct, a lost memory, a dream that now seemed utterly impossible. This, he thought, was the end, not with a bang, but with a quiet, agonizing whimper, a surrender to the darkness, a final, complete defeat. The suffocating weight of despair pressed down on Mateo, threatening to crush the last vestiges of his will. But then, a faint image, like a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness, pierced through the gloom. It was his daughter's laugh, a sound he hadn't truly heard in years, a pure, innocent melody that resonated deep within his shattered soul. It wasn't a memory, not exactly, but a visceral feeling, a powerful echo of love, of purpose, of a future he still desperately yearned for. He opened his eyes, a renewed spark of defiance rekindling within their depths. He was a broken man, yes, a sinner, but he was also a father, and that, he realized, was a truth more powerful than any despair, more resilient than any terror. He couldn't give up, not now, not while even a sliver of possibility remained. His daughter deserved better. She deserved a father who fought, who never surrendered, no matter the odds. He had to try, even if it meant certain death, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The journal, despite his broken hand, was still a key, a map to understanding the enemy. He would find a way to read it, to decipher Miguel's cryptic warnings, to unearth the counter-ritual, no matter the cost, no matter the pain. His gaze fell upon Elias, an old, wizened inmate 2 cells down, a man of quiet dignity and sharp intellect. Elias, a political prisoner from the Civil War era, had been in this facility, in its various iterations, for decades, his eyes holding the weariness of 1,000 untold stories. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of profound wisdom and a chilling understanding of the prison's deeper, darker currents. Mateo had observed Elias carefully, noticing his silent, almost imperceptible nods during the mess hall riot, his knowing glances when Mateo had been brutalized by the guard, a silent acknowledgement of their shared plight, their shared witness to the unfolding horrors. Mateo knew the risk approaching another inmate, especially one as respected and feared as Elias, but he had no other choice. He waited for the opportune moment, when the guards' patrols were at their most infrequent, when the cell block was quiet, when the other inmates were lost in the haze of sleep or their own waking nightmares. He slowly, carefully, made his way to Elias's cell door, his injured wrist throbbing with each movement. "Elias," Mateo whispered, his voice hoarse, a desperate plea. "I need your help." Elias opened his eyes, slowly, deliberately, his gaze surprisingly sharp, betraying no surprise, no fear, only a deep, unsettling knowing. He had clearly anticipated this moment, this desperate plea. "I know about the whispers," Mateo continued, his voice barely audible. "And I know about the journal. I know about the entity." Elias's eyes flickered, a subtle acknowledgement of Mateo's terrifying truth. "I need you to read it for me, Elias," Mateo pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "My hand, it's broken. I can't read it myself, but I know there's a way to stop it." Elias looked at him for a long moment, his gaze piercing, scrutinizing, as if weighing Mateo's very soul. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, he extended a hand through the bars, his aged fingers surprisingly strong. "Bring it," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The truth. It demands to be heard." A wave of relief, so profound it almost brought Mateo to his knees, washed over him. He carefully retrieved the journal from beneath his mattress, holding it awkwardly in his good hand, and passed it through the bars to Elias. As Elias carefully opened the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the faded script, the whispers in the cell block seemed to intensify, swirling around them, a frantic chorus of unseen voices, both warning and desperate hope. Elias's brow furrowed, his lips moving silently as he deciphered Miguel's frantic entries, his eyes wide with a shared horror. After what felt like an eternity, Elias looked up, his face grim, but a spark of something, a glimmer of desperate resolution, now burning in his ancient eyes. "It speaks of a counter-ritual," Elias whispered, his voice low and urgent. "A way to sever the entity's power, to send it back to where it came from. But it requires sacrifice, Mateo. A specific place, a specific time, and something precious to break its hold." Mateo nodded, his gaze unwavering. Sacrifice, he understood. He was ready to pay any price, to make any sacrifice, to ensure his daughter had a future, to prevent this nightmare from consuming them all. Their purpose was redefined, their goal now clear, a desperate, shared mission in the face of overwhelming evil. They were no longer just prisoners, they were conspirators, united against a common enemy, human and supernatural, forging a fragile, desperate alliance in the heart of hell. With Elias's help, the journal's cryptic messages began to unravel, revealing a terrifying map to the entity's power. The counter-ritual, Elias explained, had to be performed in the deepest part of the old utility tunnels, at the precise moment of midnight, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. It required a symbolic sacrifice, not of blood, but of a deeply cherished personal item, something imbued with profound emotional significance, offered with a pure heart. Mateo immediately knew what he had to use, a small, faded photograph of his daughter, her innocent smile a stark contrast to the darkness surrounding them. It was his most treasured possession, his only link to hope, and therefore the perfect offering. Their plan, meticulously crafted in hushed whispers over several nights, was fraught with unimaginable risks. They needed a diversion to draw the guards away, access to the sealed utility tunnels, and the element of surprise against an entity that permeated the very fabric of the prison. Elias, with his decades of observation, knew the routines, the blind spots, the subtle shifts in power dynamics within the guards' ranks. He suggested they exploit the simmering gang rivalries, inciting a controlled riot in the main yard, a chaotic spectacle that would draw every available guard, leaving the deeper parts of the prison momentarily unguarded. It was a dangerous gamble, a brutal calculation, but the stakes were too high to consider less drastic measures. The chosen night arrived, heavy with an oppressive stillness, the air thick with an almost tangible dread. At exactly 11:30, as planned, a prearranged signal, a single, piercing whistle, echoed through the cell blocks. Chaos erupted in the main yard. Shouts, screams, the clash of bodies, and the unmistakable crack of batons filled the air, a violent symphony that drew the guards like moths to a flame. Elias and Mateo, hidden in the shadows of the laundry room, heard the frantic footsteps, the shouted orders, the rush of blue uniforms towards the source of the disturbance. The prison, for a brief, terrifying window, was theirs to navigate. Mateo, using a heavy wrench Elias had pilfered, struggled with his broken hand, but managed to pry open the rusted access panel to the utility tunnels. A blast of cold, stale air, thick with the scent of damp earth, and something far more ancient assailed them. The whispers, now a deafening roar, pulsed from the darkness below, a terrifying chorus of tormented souls. Elias, moving with surprising agility for his age, descended first, Mateo following, his heart pounding, the photograph of his daughter clutched tightly in his good hand. The tunnels were a labyrinth of crumbling concrete and rusted pipes, the air heavy with unseen presences. Shadows writhed at the edges of their vision. Spectral figures flickered past, their mournful cries echoing from the depths. The entity was aware of their intrusion, its power growing, sensing their intent. They pressed on, guided by Elias's intimate knowledge of the prison's forgotten infrastructure, deeper and deeper into the earth, the temperature dropping with every step, the whispers growing louder, more menacing. Finally, they reached the core, a circular chamber deep beneath the prison, its walls covered in the same crude, ancient symbols Mateo had seen in the shower block. In the center, a dark, pulsating vortex of energy shimmered, its malevolent aura radiating palpable dread. This was it, the entity's heart, the source of its power, the nexus of its unholy connection to this world. As they entered the chamber, the air crackled with dark energy, and a terrifying guttural roar erupted from the vortex, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Spectral figures, more defined now, manifested around them, their hollow eyes burning with a desperate fury, attempting to bar their way. "Now, Mateo," Elias urged, his voice strained, "offer your sacrifice." Mateo stepped forward, his body trembling, but his resolve firm. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a chorus of anguish and fury, as the vortex pulsed violently, its dark tendrils reaching out, attempting to ensnare him. He held up the photograph, his daughter's smiling face illuminated by the faint, eerie glow of the chamber, a beacon of purity against the overwhelming darkness. "For her," he whispered, his voice resonating with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "For all of them." He cast the photograph into the swirling vortex, a single, pure act of love and sacrifice. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a blinding flash of light erupted from the vortex, a searing, white heat that pushed back the shadows, silencing the whispers. The spectral figures shrieked, their forms dissolving, scattering like dust in the wind. The entity, its roar now a desperate wail, began to convulse, its dark energy receding, shrinking, pulling back into itself. The ancient symbols on the wall faded, their power broken. The very foundations of the chamber seemed to groan, to shift, as if the earth itself was trying to expel the monstrous presence. The air cleared, the oppressive dread replaced by a sudden, exhilarating lightness, a quiet peace that settled over the chamber. The entity was gone, banished, its hold broken, its power severed. The human laws of the prison, its brutal hierarchy, they had shown their limits in this place, but the ancient, supernatural law, the power of sacrifice, had proved to be the ultimate arbiter, revealing its raw, transformative force. They had won, but at what cost, Mateo wondered, as the sounds of the riot, above them, still raging, pulled him back to the harsh reality of their world. The silence that followed the entity's banishment was profound, a blessed cessation of the whispers and the oppressive dread. Mateo stood in the now calm chamber, his body trembling, his good hand aching from the effort, his broken wrist throbbing with a dull pain. Elias, leaning heavily against a crumbling wall, his face etched with exhaustion, offered a weary but triumphant smile. "It is done, Mateo," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "The nightmare, it is broken." But the nightmare of the prison itself, the one crafted by human hands, was far from over. As they emerged from the utility tunnels, blinking in the dim light of the laundry room, the echoes of the riot still raged above them. Shouts and the metallic clang of cell doors still punctuated the air, a stark reminder of the chaos they had orchestrated, the brutal cost of their desperate plan. They had stopped the supernatural entity, but the human consequences of their actions were just beginning to unfold. Mateo and Elias were quickly discovered by a patrol of guards, their faces grim, their batons held high. The diversion, successful as it was, had left a trail of violence and destruction in the main yard, and the guards, enraged by the uprising, were seeking retribution. There was no explanation they could offer, no truth that would be believed, no tale of banished entities that would spare them from the brutal reality of their situation. They were caught undeniably, hopelessly, and the price for their actions, for their temporary triumph, would be severe. They were thrown into solitary confinement, separate cells deep in the darkest, most desolate part of the prison, a place where the sun never reached, where the screams of other inmates were muffled to mere whimpers. Days blurred into an agonizing haze of hunger, thirst, and the chilling silence that only solitary could provide. Mateo's broken wrist festered, a constant source of agony, and his body, already weakened, began to succumb to the deprivation. He felt the cold touch of delirium, the edges of his sanity fraying. But even in his feverish state, he felt a strange, quiet peace. The whispers were gone, the crushing dread lifted, replaced by a profound, if melancholic, tranquility. The entity was gone, and that knowledge, that single, undeniable truth, was a comfort far deeper than any physical pain. When they finally released him, weeks later, Mateo was a shadow of his former self, gaunt, his skin pale, his body frail. His wrist had healed, but poorly, leaving it permanently stiff, a constant reminder of his journey, his sacrifice. He no longer walked with a bowed head, no longer sought invisibility. His eyes, though weary, held a quiet intensity, a deep understanding that set him apart from the other inmates. He had seen the true face of evil, both human and supernatural, and he had faced it, and he had, in his own way, prevailed. Elias, too, had changed. His eyes, once so sharp, now held a deeper, almost mystical quality, a quiet knowing that transcended the prison walls. They shared a silent bond, an unspoken understanding forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Two survivors of a nightmare no one else would ever believe. They were pariahs, marked men, but they were also heroes in their own desperate, forgotten narrative, the last witnesses to a truth that could never be fully told. The prison itself, however, remained unchanged in its outward appearance, still a monument to control, to human cruelty. The guards were still brutal, the gangs still fought, the cycle of violence continued unbroken. But Mateo knew, with an unshakable certainty, that something fundamental had shifted beneath its foundation. The cold spots were gone, the whispers were silent, and the oppressive, pervasive dread that had once clung to every stone, every shadow, had lifted. The entity's absence was a palpable thing, a quiet vacuum in the heart of the prison. The violence still existed, yes, but it was now only human violence, devoid of the insidious, supernatural malevolence that had once fueled it. Mateo had paid a heavy price, his body scarred, his spirit forever changed, his freedom a distant, impossible dream. He had lost his cherished photograph, his tangible link to his daughter, a sacrifice made for a greater good. But he had gained something too, an inner strength, a profound sense of purpose, a quiet acceptance of his grim reality. He was the last survivor of that terrible night, a living testament to a horror no one would ever acknowledge, a silent guardian of a secret buried deep within the earth, within the very walls of CECOT. He had transformed, no longer just a prisoner, but a reluctant warrior, a survivor, carrying the burden of truth, forever altered by the crucible of fear, faith, and sacrifice. Life in CECOT settled back into its grim, monotonous rhythm. But for Mateo, everything had shifted. The absence of the entity, its malevolent hum, left a peculiar emptiness, a quiet echo in the once haunted corridors. He still served his time, the days bleeding into weeks, then months, his body and spirit slowly mending, adapting to this new, quiet despair. His crippled wrist was a constant throb, a physical scar reflecting the deeper, internal wounds, but it no longer defined him. He was a man who had faced true darkness and emerged, battered but unbroken. Elias, his only confidant, his silent ally, remained a pillar of quiet strength. Their conversations were few, often just knowing glances exchanged across the yard, nods of shared understanding, a wordless communion that spoke volumes. They carried the secret between them, a heavy, unspoken burden, a truth too terrifying for anyone else to comprehend, too dangerous to ever utter aloud. The other inmates, oblivious to the deeper war that had been waged and won, still saw Mateo as just another convict, maybe a little tougher, a little more distant, but ultimately just another statistic in this human warehouse. The guards, too, had their own narratives, attributing the quieter period after the riot to their enhanced security, their brutal efficiency, never suspecting the true cosmic conflict that had been resolved beneath their feet. Mateo often found himself staring at the spot in his cell where the journal had been hidden, where the apparition had pointed. It was just a patch of concrete now, unremarkable, blending seamlessly with the wall. But in his mind, he saw the faint outlines of the ancient symbols, the spectral finger, the promise of a deeper truth. He carried those images, those memories, like a heavy stone in his heart, a constant reminder of the horrific knowledge he possessed. He mourned the loss of his daughter's photograph, a tangible piece of her, a part of his soul offered in sacrifice. Yet he also felt a strange lightness, a freedom from the pervasive dread that had once suffocated him. He had paid a price, yes, but he had also saved something, not just himself, but perhaps in some small, unseen way, the very soul of the prison itself, cleansing it of an ancient, festering evil. He watched the sun set through the narrow slit of his cell window, the sky bleeding into hues of orange and purple, a fleeting glimpse of beauty in the heart of ugliness. He no longer clung to the impossible dream of seeing his daughter again in this life. That hope had been offered to the darkness, replaced by a deeper, more spiritual resolve. He understood now that his fight for her was not about physical freedom, but about enduring, about carrying the light of hope, however dim, within himself, about never letting the darkness consume him completely. He would survive, not just for himself, but for the memory of what he had faced, for the unspoken promise he had made to the spectral voices, for the quiet triumph he had achieved. The future remained uncertain, a relentless march of identical days, each one a test of his endurance, his will. He would likely die in this place, a forgotten man in a forgotten corner of the world. But he would die with his soul intact, his mind clear, a silent victor in a war no one else knew had been fought. He was the last survivor of that night, a living legend to himself, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. His story would never be told, his name never remembered beyond these walls, but his journey, his transformation, had left an indelible mark, not just on him, but on the very essence of CECOT, a subtle change, an unseen shift that whispered of a hidden victory, a quiet end to an ancient terror. The prison would continue, a brutal cage, but a vital piece of its dark heart had been purged, leaving a fragile, new beginning, an almost imperceptible breath of peace in a place synonymous with torment.